Aaron, thank you so much for being on the program today. I watched all six of the videos in the series and found them to be nourishing and helpful. At MinistryWatch, we've already been writing about what we call here the new missions paradigm, and you really brought that idea to life with your videos. I want to talk specifically about some of the videos and some of the places you visited in a moment, but I'd like to start with just kind of the big why question. Why do you think it's necessary or was necessary to do a series of videos, a series of teachings on this topic?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on too, Warren. I really appreciate it and appreciate your work. Um, yeah, I guess this came from a convergence of several different conversations I've been having with friends over the years. I'm a church planter by trade. I first did a church plant in Vancouver, British Columbia, where I grew up, and then also one here in Iowa before moving to Dordt University 15 years ago. And 17 years ago, my wife and I founded a missions organization in Liberia, West Africa, called One Body, One Hope. And as that began to grow, um, my initial thought, and was just, I think, assumption anybody else would have, well, I guess I'm going to quit my job and become a missionary. However, through that process, realized that the people we were working with there um, were so much more culturally adept, were so much better prepared to do ministry instantaneously in that culture. And yeah, and I confidentially went out and started fundraising, figuring, I guess I'll quit my job, I'll move to Liberia, I'll become a missionary. And by the time I calculated what the cost of that was going to be, realized we could just about hire like literally 100 Liberian pastors for the same cost as me going over. So I started asking a lot of questions about stewardship and effectiveness. So yeah, efficacy and efficiency in missions and what's taking place. And asking the question too, what time is it in the kingdom of God? And there are people with a Christian foothold in virtually every country on earth. And is the old model of sending from the West to the rest still how we need to be thinking about missions? And lo and behold, found there were a number of other people already thinking these things, talking about the new paradigm, describing it in terms like that, and got excited about educating more people and figured a video study series could be a great way to do that.
Now, one of the things that you say near the beginning of the first video, which is kind of a table setting for everything that follows, is that, in fact, you use these exact words. You say we're lost. And by we're lost, I think you mean the Western church. And what do you mean by that?
I think for the most part, we've forgotten our initial first calling, right? The Great Commission. I think some good Barna research recently revealed what little percentage of North American Christians actually even know what the Great Commission is, let alone the fact that I guess it's what I would describe and do describe in that video as, Jesus gave the church its mission statement. And that really was go into all the world and teaching and baptizing, right? That's our mandate. And so churches can so easily become about functioning of themselves and perpetuating the institutions that they are, as opposed to always looking outward. And that's where our gaze is supposed to be. So when I say we're lost, I think we've lost our primary objective at times, and that's to expand the kingdom and invite more in.
Yeah. The Great Commission says, though, to go and to make disciples. Is what you're proposing, it seems to me, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, that what you're proposing is not an either or situation, but in some ways a both and situation. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I know. I think it's a really good way to put it. You can go a lot of places in the world today by doing a lot of things. I could watch a great documentary on cuisine in India, and in many ways, I feel like I've gone there. I can go by supporting others, and sometimes I can go by going myself. So yeah, definitely a both and approach.
One of the things that I loved about the video series, especially video number two, the second video called Claiming Our Roots and Dreaming Our Future, is you don't dishonor the people that went before. You talk very glowingly, for example, of the Apostle Thomas, who ended up in India, from the Middle East. I mean, he went from Jerusalem to Chennai, which is all the way over on the east coast of India. And I can't remember the exact number, but you said even today, that if you drove that route, it would be nearly 8,000 miles. I mean, that is just a kind of a remarkable, almost unbelievable achievement for somebody in the first century to have probably walked or ridden in carts and, on the back of animals, that distance. So you honor that heritage. You mentioned William Carey very prominently as well, who translated the Bible into 40 languages and, is considered in many ways the, a father of near Asian missions. So you honor that past, but the point that you're making in honoring that past is that these faithful missionaries of centuries past, they went and they made disciples. And what we have now is a very different situation than the situation they faced then. That, for example, in places like India and South America and many parts of Asia, we have faithful, godly Christian leaders whose families have been Christian in many cases for generations, if not hundreds of years, and that now that our approach should shift based on that new reality, that we should, as you said a few moments ago, be supporting them with as much vigor as the missionaries of generations past went themselves. Am I reading you right? Am I hearing you right in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I would say our goals really in this series were threefold. One, to rekindle a passion for the Great Commission, and get churches excited about that, analyzing, are we putting our resources toward this? Are we putting our time toward this? Honoring those who've gone before, but then asking some new questions about once you hit a certain saturation point with the spread of the gospel, at what point in time is the ownership and the development of that really belong in the hands of the indigenous peoples who are there? And what are they actually asking for resources? Off the camera, I asked the president of a seminary in Mexico, tell me about your opinion on short-term mission trips or about missionaries coming to Mexico. And yeah, he very quickly replied, like, I understand the heart and the impetus behind that, but I would never presume to go into America and have a level of authority at times that people seem to assume when they would come here. And we already have, he said, I've got pastors lined up ready to do this work, evangelists lined up ready to do this work. If you guys would just ask, I would tell you, please send me professors and send me books. Those are the two things we need to spread the gospel here faster, not more people being sent. And so I think just taking the humble posture of asking church leaders in the places where we're going all over the world, what is it that you need? You've been looking at this for a long time. You have a heart for the spread of the gospel. What are you actually asking for, and how can we help you in that?
Yeah. One of the ideas that you brought up, in fact, you devoted one of the 6 videos to this, is this idea of redemption and lift. And I want you to talk about that. What do you mean by that? And then I have a follow-up question, but I'm going to let you answer that question first. What do you mean by the lift part of that, of the redemption and lift?
I watched the ministry of Jesus himself. Is God, the gospel he proclaimed was entirely comprehensive, and he was very much interested in people's physical ailments or sicknesses or the places of their deepest hurt relationally, and often found actually the most fertile ground for the soil, fertile soil and fertile ground for the reception of the gospel in those places. And I think sometimes we've thought about missions too reductionistically, talking about the proclamation of the word. But even to look at the model of Jesus and how he taught his disciples to go out, right? Cast out demons and tend to the poor. There's real physical needs. And when we address that, we honor the comprehensive nature of the redemption that Christ sought to bring us, and also create a more effective means of ministry. So if we're going into a place that's completely war-torn and not tending to those needs, and yet trying to just proclaim the gospel and then walking out. It doesn't seem to me to be consistent with how even Christ himself approached telling the world about the relationship they needed to have with his Father.
Well, I, of course, completely believe that, Aaron, and I believe that the gospel not only brings redemption, but it also brings flourishing to the communities and to the nations we bring the gospel to. However, I'm going to gently play devil's advocate on that idea and ask for your thoughts.
Sure.
There is a history of the Western Church of what is sometimes called rice bowl evangelism, where we might go into a place with good intentions of bringing not only the gospel and the good news of Jesus, the redemptive story of Jesus, but we come in with as well, programs to feed the poor and to house the unhoused and so on, and that has some of those efforts have fallen down have sort of slid down a slippery slope and become pure benevolence ministries or relief and development ministries, or worse, have the worst kind of colonialism and the worst kind of arrogance on the part of Westerners. So how would you respond to that critique of the redemption and uplift message that you guys are trying to get across?
I think it's a highlighting of the redemption and lift, right? It's not an either or. There are missional efforts that have devolved into social gospel and nothing more, or efforts accordingly, or benevolent ministries that aren't proclaiming the word. And so I think it's ability to hold both of those things up at the same time. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. In fact, a full reading of the gospel, I think, requires it to be, here again, a both and.
Yeah. Well, you struck close to home for me because I have been to India. I've been to Chennai. I've been to one of the places that you highlighted, the where St. Thomas went, and the church there, which supposedly houses his relics, some of his at least one or two of his bones there. I've actually been to those places. I've been to Monrovia, Liberia, to where the Ebola pandemic crisis occurred. Those are two places that you went to in your video series, and I want to focus on Monrovia and Liberia first, because I found that story to be particularly moving when I was there, and I thought you guys did a great job of bringing that story to life with your interview of Nancy Wrightbowl. Would you briefly tell that story and why you thought it was important to tell at this point in your narrative?
Yeah. Well, one, Nancy's life would be a great example of redemption and lift, trying to provide very practical means in a country that was destroyed by back-to-back civil wars that lasted 15 years, right? You have an entire generation that didn't have access to education, literacy, farms fell fallow. The physical need was astronomical. And then, of course, against that backdrop, to see the Ebola crisis hit, people who are already, some of the people on earth who struggle the most, one of the poorest economies. That was a real personal story for me. I've known Nancy for years, had stayed there many, many times. I have two adopted children from Liberia, and, Rick Sacra, one of the doctors who got incredibly sick and was airlifted out, just like Nancy was from Ebola, was somebody who gave my daughter life-saving medications in order to get her out of country and to take care of her. And the next time I see these people's names, it's on the news, because their lives are threatened. But to see people like that who want to go back, right? That the cost of discipleship was counted, and it was responded to and then entered right back into, like, on both of their accounts. Beautiful, beautiful stories of people who understand the hard work of missions, and who understand the point of being there to help create infrastructure that's going to serve people years, decades after they're gone.
Yeah. While we're in Liberia, let me just pause there for another minute because you also told a story from the Foya region of Liberia. For those of you who know, Liberia is in West Africa. Monrovia is on the coast, but there are interior states and towns that are very difficult to get to from Monrovia. In fact, when I was in Liberia, we went from Monrovia to Foya. You could drive it. I think it would have probably taken 7 or 8, maybe even 9 hours in a 4-wheel drive vehicle going probably 10 or 15 miles an hour. We ended up going in a Samaritan's Purse plane from Monrovia to Foya, and I was able to sort of see, what a remote part of the world that was and how difficult to get to. But you tell a story of a Swedish missionary who and I may not be remembering this right, Aaron, but I think he might have been the first missionary to that region in Africa, or certainly one of the early missionaries there, the Swedish missionary, and the legacy that his efforts left. Can you briefly tell that story?
Yeah, I mean, his story is incredibly impactful for me, my significant partner in ministry in Liberia, who leads all of our church planting and development efforts there. Grew up in a little town outside of Foya, a little village where no Christian witness had ever been. And one day a Swedish missionary showed up that created a rippling effect of transformation and the spread of the gospel through that region, through families that have become the backbone of the ministry that we work with there. And right, so here's the indebtedness to those who've gone before and walked into some incredibly difficult places, and gave their lives to this. And yeah, so somebody who was being brought up to be a witch doctor ended up becoming the Christian pastor and evangelist who leads our movement there and has planted 40 plus churches now in Liberia, all because a missionary answered the call to go to this tiny little village where no Christian witness had ever been, as far as we can tell, and begin an absolute transforming effect.
But now, fast forward several generations, and the real um, work of the church there is not being done by missionaries, but it's being done by the descendants of those people who were evangelized by the Swedish missionary. And so the call to us today, again, to repeat, is not necessarily to go to Foya, even though you and I have both been there and seen what's happening there, but rather to support those faithful men and women who are there. In fact, at one point you say that 90% of the pioneering work in the world, the pioneering evangelistic and disciple making work in the world, is now not being done by Westerners, but is being done by these indigenous pastors. And yet you say that only about 10% of the funds that are directed towards missionary efforts are directed towards those very people. So that, to me, was both a great story of the legacy of a Swedish missionary who went, but also an object lesson for us today that the real need is to support these godly men and women who are there, who are the fruit of those early missionary efforts, and now need our help, but they need it in different ways.
Yeah, that's really well said. That's exactly it. They need our help, but need it in different ways. I also think it's important in these conversations to reiterate, it's not just them that need our assistance, it's us that need them, right? Missions is supposed to be a reciprocal relationship. I have learned so many things by visiting churches elsewhere in the world that I never learned in a world-class seminary in North America.
Right.
The way that their social lives, the way that they live out being believers is just truly inspiring. And there's elements of their faith that caused me to push back. Like I was always told, you know, Aaron, when you get to Africa, you're going to find out that the gospel is a mile wide and an inch deep. Um, and I've found actually that the faith of the people that I've encountered there to be the exact opposite. Deep and inspiring to everybody who has ever gone with me to go and visit, to see like, wow, this is the real deal. These people are living out faith in the gospel every day in their lives in ways that I wish our church could back home.
Yeah. Well, if you'll forgive me, just a point of personal privilege. When I was in Foya, I met a man who had adopted 15, 16, 17 children. I can't remember the exact number now. Orphans who had been orphaned because of the Ebola um, um, uh, disease, the disease of Ebola, which is just a horrible, horrible disease. And to this day, that is one of the most moving experiences of my life, to stand in that cemetery there and see, more than 200 gravestones from just this little village that many of them were whole families that had been wiped out by Ebola. Their deaths were, in some cases, were within hours of each other. But then to meet that man that adopted all of those children, and he had fewer resources than I did. It was, when you talk about learning from them as opposed to us teaching them, that was a stark moment for me. I know I came home from Liberia. My wife and I immediately went through a foster parenting program here and became foster parents, in as a direct result of going there and just seeing the sacrificial way that they were living out you talk about caring for widows and orphans, as James says. They were doing that in such a real and tangible way that I don't want to, should I say I was shamed? Was I embarrassed? That I don't know if those are the right biblical words, but I was certainly convicted that I was not doing enough. So if you'll forgive me for that personal story there of just affirming what you said, that when we go, we need to go with humility and with a willingness to listen and learn ourselves.
That's really well said, and thank you for sharing the aspect, how the personal impact. I've had the same thing for myself. Our primary ministry leader there, Emmanuel Bimba, who you meet in the video series. But we didn't cover this part of his story. When the Civil War was done, and he literally collected over 60 kids whose parents had died in the war, some who were still clinging to the dead bodies of their parents, took them all in with no resources. Many of them now, 17 years later, are graduating college. They're becoming the leaders, the pastors, the teachers in our ministry. I mean, it's a beautiful generational change story. But one of the little girls that he had taken in had ingested battery acid and burned her throat out, and she was not going to live. And so he called me one day and said, Aaron, this girl that I've taken in as my own, my daughter, she will not live. I need you to adopt her. I know that you can get medical care in America that I can't get here. And I said, oh, Emmanuel, I'm going to, adopting a child is a big decision. I'm going to need to think about that. 1 week later, he called and said, have you decided yet? She's still very, very sick. I said, I need more time to pray. And he just said, I do not understand you Americans. I collected 70 children who had nowhere to go because I knew that's what Jesus would want me to do. I'm asking you to take one, and I know you're a more wealthy man than I, and you need more time to pray. He said, I'll never understand you Americans. And like, that was a deeply convicting moment and led to the adoption of my daughter and change my own family tree. I mean, it's been beautifully redemptive, but instances like that prove again, right? This is a part of the world, and there are many where the faith being lived out by these people have so much to teach us, and I've been so blessed by it.
Yeah, yeah. I want to move along to the fifth video in your series. It's called Reverse Missions, and you start that video by sort of walking along a road with just little, you say in the video, literally a stone's throw from the U.S.-Mexican border. The Maquiladores, which is the Maquiladore. It's a that's where we would get the word machine or manufacturing. It's where a lot of international and even American manufacturers have set up shop just over the Mexican border. They do it for a variety of reasons, but one of them is economic. One of them is financial. They realize that they can get a return on investment. And you use that as a way to talk about the finances of doing mission work, and you talk about a return on investment. And I want you to say a little bit more about that, because I think that some people who maybe haven't thought this issue through completely might think that this is just a dollars and cents calculation, that it's about financial efficiency, and not about the effectiveness of the gospel, as if those two are separate issues. In fact, you even say in the video that it's just a question, that there's a biblical word for this, for financial effectiveness, and that biblical word is stewardship. And that God, while he calls us to go, while he calls us to make disciples, he also calls us to be faithful stewards. Can you say more about that idea?
Yeah, and I want to be careful here, right? Because every single human life is of infinite value to God. And there may well be instances where God calls one person to go one place, labor for 30 years, because there's one convert there that's going to change something longer term. And so the measurement of effectiveness and success of any missional effort isn't merely numerical. However, if I went to a donor today and said, if you gave $1,000 toward this project, there'll be 5 new believers at the end of the day. Or if you give $1,000 toward this project, there's going to be 100. My guess is they're going to ask me some more questions about the one that's promising a greater return. And so this is where I'm trying to hold this conversation in tension, right? I respect and believe that there are places where we are called, but I think we're also supposed to ask some of the questions of not should this work happen or should it not, but for me, the stewardship part of this is who is most effective to be doing this work, right? I'm not saying the gospel shouldn't be preached in Sierra Leone or Afghanistan, but if it's more stewardly for a local national or indigenous leader to do that, and that's going to be more effective, why would we not entertain that conversation in terms of effectiveness? No church just builds a building today and takes the first bid that comes along from a contractor. They're trying to be stewardly with their money. They're going to get the best interest rate that they can on that loan. They ask all those questions. So somewhere in the conversation about how we operate all of our ministries, there is a responsibility of stewardship. And that's what we're trying to introduce in the conversation around missions a little more deeply.
Yeah. Let's sort of wrap up our conversation, Aaron, by, with a sort of a couple of questions here in closing. One of those questions is this: are you seeing signs of life, so to speak? Are you seeing either places or organizations here in the United States or elsewhere around the world that are embracing this new missions model, this new missions paradigm? Would you be willing to name some names and tell us who they are?
Yeah. I mean, we didn't advertise this and even name them necessarily in the videos because the idea wasn't to create promotion for them. But the reason why we visited the places we did, like in India, um, we wanted to find organizations that were living this out and had been very effectively for a long time. So we partnered with some individuals from Missions India. We went to Mexico and went to All Nations Seminary in Juarez because they were really operating out of this model. My heart has been warmed to this through my work with One Body, One Hope in Liberia. So that was another reason why we went there. We are seeing response from people. I had conversations 2 weeks ago with leaders from a denomination who are asking, can we use this in training of some of our ministry leaders to help people think differently about this? And that's our goal, that churches, deacons, missions committees, seminaries, colleges, Sunday schools would be picking up these materials and starting to think and have a little bit of impact and moving the needle on this conversation, embracing the new paradigm.
Well, and that takes me to my final question, which is, how do you want churches to use it? One of the things that I found to be very effective about the videos is that there are 6 of them, and they're short. They're 10 to 12 minutes long. You've got study guides with each one of the video episodes. Is it your intention that churches and small groups and missions committees within churches would watch these videos and use the study guides as prompts for a deeper discussion within those churches, and maybe even to revisit and to look again at the way they do missions?
Absolutely. That is the objective of all of this, that as many people as possible. We try to create all the content and the resources at a level that was accessible to a high school Sunday school class, to a seniors Bible study, to a deacons committee. At any one of those levels, you're right, we did them short and kind of punchy to that effect, and hopefully filmed them as beautifully as we could, telling the story from all over the world, introducing people to some of the modern heroes of our faith. That was absolutely the goal. And then, of course, to be able to do that the way we did, so blessed. A generous benefactor who believes deeply in this model funded the entire project so that there would not be a dollar cost to anybody who wants to access the materials. They're free on Right Now Media. They're free on our website. All the study guides are all free PDF downloads, and that was the goal.
Yeah. Well, to that end, to all our watchers that are seeing this on YouTube or listeners on the podcast, please know that in the show notes for today's program, we'll include a link so that you can watch all of the videos for free yourself, and you can download the PDFs. So, Aaron, I said that that last question was my final question, but I am going to ask one more, which is anything else you want to add? Anything that I'm maybe not smart enough to ask, or any idea that maybe we have discussed that you would like to reiterate and emphasize here in closing?
I think maybe just lastly, we're humbly putting this forward as part of the conversation. We're not claiming to be the last word. We're hoping in a lot of circles it's the first word in conversations that follow and people getting excited about missions. We're going to continue to learn new things. I come from a Reformed tradition that refers to semper reformata over and over again. Reformed and always reforming according to the Word of God, and that's the goal. So hopefully this contributes in our time to some part of the conversation, and hopefully others continue that on too.
Well, I pray that it may be so. And Aaron, I'm grateful for this project, for these videos, for these very nourishing materials. Grateful for your work, and finally, grateful that you would take a few minutes to be on the program today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Warren. That means a lot. Those words coming from you. Appreciate it.